Tonight we're going to be looking at the story of Esther, and it's really an interesting story. Nothing else really quite like it in the Bible, and so I'm looking forward to working through this story with everybody tonight. Before we get started with the story, though, I thought maybe we could talk a little bit. What makes something stand out in your mind? What makes something stand out in your mind?
Anne says something that's unusual.
Okay, so something that's unusual, unexpected, different, novel. Pick your favorite word there, but unexpected.
Something that has strong emotion attached to it.
Okay, so sometimes the magnitude of something makes it much more memorable or attention grabbing.
Mm-hmm.
What else?
Someone with, I'm not sure whether we've said this or not, but something or someone, for example, that stands out with some great talent.
Okay, so something notable, maybe rare or exceptional. Yeah. Things that stand out, there's kind of a techie word for it, but things that stand out are said to be salient, right? There are many ways for something to become salient, and one promising or prominent one is contrast. Some of the ideas that you guys suggested are really kind of specific instances of contrast. In fact, I actually used contrast on my slide, right? I've got a different color for some of the words in the question, so they stand out from some of the others. They're different, not necessarily exciting or exceptional in any way, except they're just different. I put some words by themselves on the same line, so those same words that are highlighted are also on a separate line. And that contrasts them with everything that's going on around it. In a setting where we expect variety, similarity is salient, right? So if we walked into the church building and we see a group of people wearing the same shirt in one of our assemblies, that's kind of novel and different, isn't it? Because we expect everybody to kind of be wearing their own thing and looking a little bit different. But then we see this group of people over here that are all wearing the same shirt. We think maybe we got a visiting group from somewhere out of town that have been to an event of some sort, perhaps. And it draws our attention because where we're expecting variety, we see a lot of similarity. And it works the other way too. If we're in a place where we're expecting a lot of similarity, but we see a lot of variety or something quite different, it stands out. So if we went to an LCU basketball game and we saw somebody wearing a gold shirt, right, that would stand out because it's not the school colors. It's not what we would expect to see. It's different. So that's one form of contrast, but there are others. For example, there was one in our lesson last week. If you remember in 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 25, the Shunammite is going to Elisha. And the text says, when the man of God saw her coming, he said to Gehazi, his servant, look, there is the Shunammite. Run at once and meet her and say to her, is all well with you? Is all well with your husband? Is all well with the child? And she answered, all is well. Now we remember, it's not all well. Her son is dead, but this is part of her single-minded resolve to get to the man of God. In this case, something is repeated so often that it captures our attention. Is all well, is all well, is all well. Rapid succession, time after time, it stands out. Well, in today's story in the book of Esther, we're going to see another form of contrast on display. Or perhaps I ought to say not on display. Because in this case, the form of contrast is scarcity. It's difficult to spot if you don't read the whole book in one sitting. And even then, You probably have to look really closely to see what isn't there. But let's set the stage a little bit for this story. Last week, we were in the reign of Jehoram, one of Ahab's sons. That was somewhere around 850 BC. So a lot of things happened between then and the time of the story of Esther. Assyria conquers Israel. The northern tribes are taken away, for the most part, never to return. Babylon then conquers Assyria and then turns their attention to Judah, who they conquer and carry into captivity in 586 BC. A few years after that, Persia conquers Babylon, and now we're going to be set in the reign of Persia. Shortly after that conquering, some of the exiles actually returned to Palestine, but there's still a lot of Jews who are still living in the Persian Empire. Xerxes, some of your translations will say, mine says Ahasuerus, is reigning over the Persian Empire at the time of our story. So we're sometime around 486 to 465 BC. Just a little bit of geographical background. The story takes place in the city of Susa, which is in modern-day Iran. Over here, we have Palestine, where they were taken from. And like I said, some Jews have returned to Palestine, but many remain after being carried away into Babylonian captivity roughly 100 years previous to the setting of this story. So I'd like for us to kind of walk through the story a little bit tonight. We can't read the whole thing by any stretch, but let's walk through the story a little bit. There's a king named Ahasuerus. He has a queen, Vashti. And in the first chapter of the book, she defies the king's command to appear at one of his banquets. And at the advice of his wise men, his companions, she's deposed. And one of the interesting things that we learn in the course of this little bit of the story is that once the king gives a royal command, it can't be taken back. Right? And so when they ask him to write this decree that she can never come into his presence ever again, and in this way it'll teach the women of Persia to mind their husbands. And so Ahasuerus thinks this is a good idea. He issues the decree. We move on into chapter 2, and Esther is chosen. Now we learn a little bit about Esther and Mordecai, who's her cousin and yet kind of her father. And notice how Mordecai is identified. The first time he's introduced in the story, he's Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. Right? So we know a lot about who Mordecai is, at least ancestrally, the very first time that we're introduced to him. And we find out that he was bringing up Hadassah, or Esther is her Persian name, the daughter of his uncle, so they're cousins. And he brought her into his own home and raised her as his own daughter. And we find out that she's very obedient to him. Not only that, she's also very beautiful, which figures into the story almost immediately. We find out that the men that were advising Ahasuerus said, hey, we ought to have kind of a bachelorette sort of a thing, I guess, if we put it in our terms today. Let's bring to you a bunch of ladies, and you can choose from among them a new queen. And at this time, Esther was taken into the king's palace, but we also find out that she had not made known her people or her kindred. Why? For Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And so we find out again here, Esther is obedient. And she hides her nationality at Mordecai's instruction. And it turns out that she is the one who is chosen to become the queen. Well, later in chapter 2, Mordecai exposes a plot by some men against the king. And we're reminded again that although Mordecai sat at the king's gate and daily was apparently interacting with servants and finding out how Esther is doing, he's an attentive father. He's sitting at the king's gate, but Esther, we're reminded, has not made known her kindred or her people, just as Mordecai commanded her. The idea is repeated again. But he finds out about a plot, and he tells it to Queen Esther, and Esther tells the king, and they find out what's going on, and they save the king from the plot. Just a brief little story that figures prominently later on. Then we're introduced to a man named Haman. All right, this is the villain of the plot, if you want to think about it in that way. And let's look at the first few verses and see how he's introduced here at the beginning of chapter 3. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him to set his throne above all the officials who were with him. Right, so he's second in command in all of Persia. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were with the king at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" And when they spoke to him day after day and he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. All right, so Haman's not content to just live with his petty grudge. He wants to destroy all the Jews everywhere in the kingdom. Mordecai doesn't bow, defying the king's command, and it creates a conflict with Haman. And I think we need to ask the question, why does Mordecai behave in this way? I don't think we want to, I'm not going to try to answer it right now. Let's just keep reading the story and see how things go. Okay, but this seems a little bit out of character, doesn't it, from what we've seen about Mordecai so far? He's an attentive, loving father. He took in his uncle's child, treated her as his own. He's at the gate every day trying to check up and make sure everything is fine with her. And yet he refuses the king's command to honor Haman by bowing down to him. Also interesting in this is we're reminded about the nationality thing again. But whereas Esther hid her nationality, Mordecai revealed it. And in fact, it's mentioned twice in short succession in this section that we just read. Could something about nationality be involved here? Let's read on, or at least move on with the story and see how things turn out. Well, Haman plots against all the Jews, not just Mordecai, as we said. And then we get to the part about the edict itself that he gets Ahasuerus to sign. He says to King Ahasuerus, "There's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom." Notice that he doesn't name who they are. He just says there's a certain group of people. Their laws are different. They do not keep the king's laws, and it's really not worth it for you to tolerate them. I'll pay money into your treasury, he says, basically, if you'll let me take care of this group of people. So the king took his signet ring away from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you." So they sent letters. They sent letters by the couriers to all the king's provinces with instruction to do what? Destroy, to kill, to annihilate the Jews, and to plunder their goods. Okay. So here we go. Mordecai hears about this. Of course, all the Jews do, everywhere. And here's how they respond. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. Mordecai obeys the law in this matter. He doesn't enter the king's gate while wearing sackcloth. Why obey this law but not the other one about bowing to Haman? It perhaps suggests that his disobedience is not due to rebellion against law, but has something to do with Haman. And so in this chapter 4, Esther and Mordecai communicate through a servant. Starting in verse 5 of chapter 4, then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed to attend to her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. So he goes to Mordecai in the square, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, the exact sum of money that Haman had promised, and so on and so forth. And then Esther, verse 10, spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. Well, Mordecai had said to Esther, why don't you go try to do something about this? And she said, well, I don't know. If I try it, I might die. And listen to what Mordecai says in response. Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though is it against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Okay, now are we surprised based on what we know about Esther? No, right? She was obedient to her cousin, her father, when he said, don't reveal your nationality. We know that she's an obedient person and respectful of the relationship that they have. And so when he asks, and notice he asks, he doesn't tell her what to do. He suggests a course of action that he thinks is probably prudent and correct. And her response is, okay, I'll do it. So she submits to his words. Interestingly, they're not commands as they were in the past, but notice what the next verse says about Mordecai. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. The roles have reversed somewhat, haven't they? He commanded her not to reveal her nationality. Now, what she has said here, he goes and does as if it is an order, a commandment. So just like she had not revealed her nationality when Mordecai commanded her not to, now Mordecai does exactly what Esther ordered him to do. Well, Esther approaches the king. He holds out the scepter. Everything's okay. And the king accepts her invitation to a feast. In fact, she invites both him and Haman to attend a feast that she wants to hold. And so they show up, and the king offers Esther anything she could possibly want for the second time. He's going to do it 4 times overall in the story. And what does Esther ask for? She asked them to attend a second feast the next day. All right, so we're moving along. The plot is continuing. Mordecai leaves that first feast, and here's what it says. Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced above all the officials and servants of the king. Then Haman said, even Queen Esther let no one but me come with the king to a feast she prepared, and tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast. And this idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. Right? So Haman was happy as happy as he could be, until he sees Mordecai again, and then everything about his life is just terrible again, right? He's furious. His wife and friends propose a solution to build a gallows and have Mordecai executed on it, and he thinks this is a grand idea. He's happy again. All right, so that same evening, actually, the king can't sleep, and he asks for the chronicles, the stories of his reign to be read. And he hears this story of how Mordecai uncovered a plot against the king. He asks if anything has been done for him, and they say, no, nothing. Just then, Haman appears. And so the king asks him to come in. Haman comes in, and the king said to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? This is chapter 6, verse 6. And Haman said to himself, okay, we have inner speech here. We know what he's thinking. He's not saying it out loud. Whom would the king delight to honor more than me? So it's kind of like having your cake and eating it too, right? He's gonna list off his wish list and get it right back. That's what he thinks, at least. Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, in which the king is worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head the royal crown is set. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let him dress the man whom the king delights to honor. Let them lead him on a horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse, just as you have said, and do so to dun, 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 Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave nothing that you have mentioned. All right, so Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. I have to wonder how enthusiastic he was in sharing those words. We're not told. I can't imagine that he was very happy about it. In fact, we know he wasn't happy about it because he went home in mourning with his head covered. And his wife, great comfort that she is, says, well, if this is happening to you now, you're going to lose out to this Mordecai. It's bad news for you, buddy. So no comfort at home either, as his wife predicts his own downfall. So the next banquet comes. The next day, the banquet comes, and the king and Haman go in to feast with Queen Esther. But now what happens? Okay, the king says, for the third time, I'll grant anything you want, even up to half my kingdom. And Esther answered in verse 3, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish. Okay, save me, rescue my life and my people. This is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Same words that were used, right, in the edict. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent. That's not such a big deal, to paraphrase what she says. And the king says, who is it? Who did this? And she said, a foe, an enemy, this wicked Haman. Right? And Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. So she reveals her nationality, that she is a member of this group of people that Haman wants to kill, and has made Ahasuerus furious, and he leaves. Haman begs, appearing to attack Esther, right? The king returns to find him falling on her couch, which I'll talk about this in a little bit more, but there's a bunch of irony going on in this story, and this is one of them. Why is he so mad at Mordecai? Well, at least in part, the stated reason is he won't bow to me. Yet what is he doing now? He's bowing to a Jewess. The Jew won't bow to him, but he bows to the Jewess, begging for his life, right? Ahasuerus sees this attack and has Haman executed on his own gallows, just as his wife suggested would be the case. So we're into chapter 8. Ahasuerus now is going to empower Esther and Mordecai to protect the Jews. Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite. Long story short, he says, I can't recall the edict, but I'll let you write another one. And so they do. And what does their edict say? The king allowed the Jews who are in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of people or province that might attack them. Same words, destroy, kill, and annihilate. No, well, what else can they do? They can plunder their goods. What's good for one group is good for the other. Have at it. Let's see what happens. And so they send this out in all the languages, use the same kinds of languages, the same sequence of events and so forth with their edict that was used with Haman's. And what we find out overall is that they're going to protect themselves from the people who are out to get them. One of the things I find kind of interesting is we're looking through this in chapter 8. Do you see how they're still named the same? I mean, we've known Haman and Mordecai for quite a while now in the story, but look how they're named. They're still referred to as Haman the Agagite and Mordecai the Jew. Why? Why would they need to keep doing this, even though we already know who these people are? Let's keep going for now, but hold that thought in the back of your head. The first edict can't be revoked, so the Jews are still in danger, but the king allows a second edict to be sent. And as I pointed out, it uses the same language that was used in the original one. Well, chapter 9 is all about kind of the climax of this whole affair. And we find out that the Jews do, in fact, defend themselves admirably. Many people are killed, but not the Jews. We don't hear about any of the Jews being killed. One of the interesting things that we do hear about, actually there are two that I wanted to highlight. One, they kill every last one of Haman's sons. Every last one of them, they kill them. And also, even though they defended themselves to kill and annihilate and destroy, they don't take plunder. Right? And in fact, it tells us not once, not twice, but 3 times in this chapter that they took no plunder. Now, here's one of those things where repetition stands out, right? It's the same words, the same phrase over and over. They laid no hands on the plunder. They laid no hands on the plunder. Why does that matter? What's the significance of them not taking plunder? We'll get there. All right. So the Jews defend themselves. Mordecai and Esther institute Purim to celebrate rest from the Jews' enemies. Mordecai is elevated to second in command in all of Persia. Basically, what it boils down to is Mordecai takes the place of Haman at the king's side, and in terms of his power and prestige within Persia. And there you have the basic story, which tells about the origins of the Jewish festival Purim. And of course, there are lots of other interesting details that we might look at in this story. The writer seems to delight in irony. I'll point out a couple of those things for us here. Just loves irony over and over. Sorry, get my screen set up here. Lots of ironic twists in the story. For example, Haman's wealth, he was trying to use it, to pay the king to allow him to plunder the Jews. And of course, he hoped to make a pretty penny off it also. But his wealth ends up in Jewish hands. In fact, we didn't read the part where it tells about how the king gave Haman's house and his whole legacy, everything that he had was given to Esther. Haman writes what he thinks is his own glorification script, but instead the honor goes to Mordecai, and Haman is humiliated. I mean, not only does the king grant this to Mordecai instead of Haman, he makes Haman be the one who has to make it so and guide him through the streets and give him honor and praise. A bitter pill for him to swallow. Haman possesses the royal signet at one point in the story, but eventually it's given to Mordecai after Haman's death. Mordecai won't bow to Haman, as I pointed out, but Haman bows, or he falls on the couch where Esther was, pleading. Lots of interesting, ironic twists. There are even more than this. But for the sake of time, let's move on. If you read carefully, you'll find out that there's a lot of satire in this story. Most of it coming at the expense of Persian men, right? Ahasuerus issues an edict about how men should rule in their own houses. Why does he have to do it, though? His own wife won't come to his party. Okay, he's not strong enough about ruling his house to actually get his wife to show up at a party. He's easily bested by both Vashti and Esther. Zeresh, Haman's wife, is stronger and more insightful than Haman. She knows how to read things and understand things. Haman keeps thinking he sees glorification for himself around the corner, but he misinterprets how things are going. And Ahasuerus, if you read the story pretty carefully, every time he has a decision to make, he asks somebody else what he should do, and the very first thing that they say is what he does. Not so much of a strong leader. It seems like he just kind of follows the course of action that other people suggest. Right? But we raised some other questions along the way, such as what's really going on between Haman and Mordecai? I mean, doesn't Haman's response to Mordecai's unwillingness to bow to him, doesn't that seem a little bit overblown? And why won't law-abiding Mordecai bow to Haman, thereby defying the king's command? Another that we talked about is why the emphasis on Jews not taking plunder when the edict granted them that right? Well, some of you will get this. There's a Paul Harvey rest of the story going on here. I remember hearing Paul Harvey on the radio when I was a kid, and I always enjoyed hearing his rest of the story. There's always an interesting twist to his stories about interesting people, their histories before they were famous, and those sorts of things. Well, the key is, as I've kind of alluded to as we've been reading through various bits of this, that the introductions of and repeated references to Mordecai and Haman are pretty important. Mordecai in chapter 2, verse 5, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, and Haman, the Agagite. Do these introductions cause you to recall anything from Israel's past? I know I've been talking for about 30 minutes, so feel free to jump in here. This is a question for you guys. Do these introductions cause you to recall anything in Israel's past? How about I give you a hint? Anyone important in Israel's history come from the tribe of Benjamin?
When
Saul
King
did, didn't he?
Saul didn't kill the King Agag, I guess.
Okay, so you brought up Saul. Saul was a son of Kish. He was a Benjaminite. He was the first king of the United Kingdom, right? And he was connected to somebody named Agag, wasn't he, as you suggested? If you look back at 1 Samuel chapter 15, you'll read the story about Saul being instructed. What was he instructed to do to the Amalekites led by Agag? Do you recall?
Wasn't it to like just completely wipe them out?
To kill, to destroy completely. And was he
And
supposed
take
to?
no plunder.
And take no plunder. What did Saul do?
Didn't wipe them out and took plunder.
He didn't wipe him out. He took Agag back to the palace with him, and he took the best of their stuff, their animals and everything else. And he tried to explain it away to Samuel by saying, I'm going to sacrifice this to God. And what was Samuel's response? God wants obedience more than sacrifice. And it's the beginning of the end, isn't it, for Saul? Right? I'm going to take the kingdom away from you, he said. Right? Now, this story is actually even older than this. In fact, you can take it all the way back to find out who the Amalekites were. In Genesis 36, we find out they're the descendants of Esau. This is a 1,000-year-old family feud. Right? When Israel came out of Egypt, who was a thorn in their side as they were trying to enter the promised land? It was the Amalekites. Over the years, they fought battles against each other. There's a long history, right? But most of it comes from, I think, what we read about in 1 Samuel 15. Saul spared Agag, and he spared the best of the livestock. He took plunder that he shouldn't have. Now we can begin to understand some of the enmity between Haman and Mordecai. The Amalekites were the bitter enemies of Israel. And when Saul disobeyed God and did not utterly destroy the Amalekites, he essentially became responsible for the threat to the Jews in Persia that we read about in this story, right? If he had done what God told him to do and completely wiped them out, would Haman have been there to threaten the Jews in Persia? No, they wouldn't have. It's kind of interesting too. Here's another point of irony that I skipped over a little bit ago, just so I could reveal it now. What Haman wanted to do to the Jews was what God commanded Saul to do to the Amalekites. Remember the words of the edict? To kill, destroy completely. And now we also have at least one frame for reading and understanding why the Jews didn't take plunder. God commanded Saul not to take plunder, but he did. And the events in Persia provide Israel with kind of a do-over in that regard. And they did what Saul should have done the first time around. And all of this really comes together to contribute to what I think of as the theological message of the story. And I think I can tie it back to our initial discussion about what makes something stand out. You know, in our study today, you didn't have much of a chance to notice this because I only read a few things and paraphrased and retold the story in my own words for most of the time. But if you were to look at this story really carefully, you would find out something interesting about Mordecai that we haven't mentioned yet. Now, there are four major characters in this story, right? King Ahasuerus, Esther, Haman, Mordecai. He's mentioned 51 times by name in the story. but we have only one instance of quoted speech for him. One in the whole book, 64 words in my English translation. By contrast, Esther speaks 424 words. Ahasuerus speaks 349 words. Even Haman, who's dead for the last 3 chapters of the book, speaks 261 words, nearly 4 times as many as Mordecai. But Mordecai's words stand out not for their abundance, but for their scarcity. He's a major character in the story. He's named 51 times. The plot revolves around his interaction with Esther and what they do to save the people. But he only spoke in recorded, captured speech once. And in fact, his words carry the theological message of the book. And we'll come back to that message in just a minute. But if you're thinking back to those words themselves, you'll say, but wait, he didn't say anything about God, did he? I mean, how can his words express a theological point of view if he doesn't even mention God? Well, no, he doesn't mention him by name. And in fact, that's another interesting aspect of this book. And it's one that has led some people over the centuries to suggest that this book ought not to be part of the Bible. I don't know if you're aware of that. There have been people over the course of time who don't see anything really redeeming about this book as to why it ought to be included in our scriptures. But although he didn't say anything about God by name, well, guess what? Nobody in the book did. Each main character is mentioned by name or title at least 45 times. How many times is God mentioned in this book? 0. Not once. Yet he's noticeable by his absence. In a collection book of books that he gave us through his servants for the purpose of revealing himself to us, there's a book in which he isn't even mentioned. But even so, aren't his fingerprints all over this story? I mean, think about what happened. The sitting queen just happened to make the king angry, prompting him to choose another queen. The selection process for that queen just happened to result in the Jewess becoming queen in a foreign land, without her nationality being revealed, no less. A Jew with a connection to the Jewish queen just happened to uncover a plot against the king and keep it from succeeding. It just happened that none of the other main characters knew about the relationship between Mordecai and Esther, even though Mordecai hung out at the gate and corresponded with Esther through servants constantly. It just happened that the king couldn't sleep one night, one very particular night. It just happened that his servants read to him the story of how Mordecai saved the king's life. It just happened that Haman wandered by at that precise moment and offered a suggestion for how to treat, quote, the man whom the king delights to honor. It just happened that after Esther revealed that Haman's plot would result in her death, the king returned to the room just in time to misinterpret what Haman was doing as he fell on the couch where Esther was sitting. You know, this series of unlikely events that just happened to fall into place, resulting in the deliverance of God's chosen people, are so improbable as to be impossible, unless it's by the hand of God that the Jews are delivered from their enemies. Thus, God is present in every aspect of the story without being mentioned at all. So what is the theological message of the book? God is sovereign. He works his purpose in unexpected and even unlikely ways, but accomplishing his will nonetheless. And notice how Mordecai's statement assumes that human action works in conjunction with divine will. Let's go read that again. Chapter 4 of Esther, verse 16, as I recall. Sorry, got a little ahead of myself there. Verse 14. Actually, back into 13. Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. Mordecai believes God is going to take care of things. He's got a plan. It's going to work out. But in essence, he says, what if you're the means by which that plan is going to happen? What if you're in this position that you're in today for the express purpose of being God's partner in what he wants to do? And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Well, hopefully, if we read this and understand it and think about it a little bit, we should know how we ought to respond, right? Isn't having a mindset exemplified by Mordecai's statement to Esther, this for such a time as this sort of an idea? Isn't that really important? Should we not be looking for opportunities to partner with God? We should live in expectation of being instruments of God's purpose. I think this is a beautiful story. I think it's very evident that it has a meaningful, powerful theological statement about who we are in relationship to God and how our wills collide, right? We all have our own ideas about what we would like to do with our lives. The more spiritual minded of us try to get that in alignment with what God is doing. But Mordecai's statement is God's going to do his thing. And his people should be ready to play their part. Who knows? Maybe for such a time as this, you are in the position that you are now. That's the beautiful story of Esther. Thoughts, comments? Any other observations, things that you've noticed in your own reading and so forth?
I guess I remember like either Mama did a Bible class on this once, like a princess class, or I was talking about it with you at some point. But I guess I always knew that Haman was, an Amalekite and all of that, and that they had history with the Jews. But I guess I never quite realized that, Haman the Agagite, King how do you say his name?
Agag.
Agag. Yeah.
We don't know.
guess
We
I
just
never-
make it up and try to sound confident every time we say it.
There you go. But I guess I never really connected the two names. So that was interesting.
Yeah. Other comments, other ideas? I know I've taken you by surprise by finishing up before 8 o'clock.
Hey, Bruce, did I miss it? Which is possible I did because I got distracted because of my phone. Why Mordecai did not bow down to Haman or stand up or whatever he was supposed to do?
Yeah, isn't that interesting? At one point in the story, Haman is angry with Mordecai because he won't bow to him. And later in the story, he's mad at him because he won't stand in his presence. He can't make up his own mind. Which is it going to be?
Okay.
Mordecai is just as offended by Haman the Agagite as Haman the Agagite is by Mordecai the Jew. I believe it's not because he was rejecting the king's rule and the king's command. It's that there was such enmity between Israel and the Amalekites, and they knew the history. Isn't it interesting? He knew that this man was an Agagite. And so there's a little bit of the I don't know, for lack of a better word, prejudice between both of them. I'm not going to bow to some Agagite. I'm not going to bow to that dirty Amalekite that has been the enemy of my people. If you read the story carefully, several different times, Haman is referred to as the enemy of the Jews. Well, who was the enemy of the Jews? The Amalekites. That's the history. And there's nothing different about this particular one. He's just as bad as the rest of them. That's the way I read it.
I wonder, Bruce, on that verse 14, I believe it is, where he says, who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Before that, he says, if you keep silent, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews. That sounds a lot like some of the old judges terminology, that he was thinking maybe in terms of a much more, I don't know, nationalistic rise and return of the Jews, and not just at this particular point where the crisis is urgent. What do you think about that?
I hadn't thought about the longer term. I kind of had just been reading it from the point of view of, hey, if you don't act, God will still take care of us. I have faith, essentially, that God will protect us, his people. But then he goes on to basically say, but God works through people. Are you going to be somebody that God will work through? Or are you going to sit back and let somebody else do it? There is similar language here to the way that the judges are introduced. They're talked about as deliverers, just as the language is here. So that's an interesting connection that I hadn't thought of.
Also, I noticed that there's kind of a shift in, calling them Israelites or Hebrews, and then they switch to like calling them, Mordecai the Jew, instead of like, why not Hebrew or Israelite or.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that myself. I know that this is the point of time in history where they came to be known as Jews during the exile in first Babylon and then Persia. That's where that name came into being. Anybody else have some insight into that? I'm not really well versed in all of that history. Something for us to look into, maybe then try to figure out an interesting point to see how these names came into being. What else? Any other comments, thoughts? All right, I guess I'm going to let everybody out 10 minutes early tonight, by my standards, that is. Next time, it will be our last meeting together in this series. The good thing about it is there are lots more of these. We could do another series on it sometime and have just as much fun, or at least I would have as much fun as I'm having going through these stories. I love these Old Testament stories and taking a closer look at them. Next time, we're going to close with my very favorite story in the whole New Old Testament, the story of Joseph. Or if I could intrigue you a little bit and give you a nugget of something to think about this week, I might say Joseph, ? So we'll be looking at Genesis 37 through 50, another big section of scripture that we won't have time to read through in its entirety. It's a wonderful story, beautifully told. I really look forward to sharing that story with everybody next time, and stay warm and dry, I hope.